Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to Medieval Church History. I'm Teresa Holman, and with me is Father Michael Witt. Welcome, Father.
Thank you, Teresa.
It is very good to be here for another show. I've just had the opportunity to just listen to part of one of our shows before we came in to record today, and I really enjoyed listening to it.
It's a fascinating era. You know, you've got some real characters, some real challenges, and well, in fact, we'll be talking about some of these challenges today, because no sooner does European civilization put itself back together again after the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West, then all of a sudden it gets attacked again, this time by Muslims, by Magyars, and by Vikings.
Oh my gosh, okay.
And we'll be looking at that in the next couple programs, but today we're going to look and see how Europe went out of its way not to be prepared for the challenges that were coming down the pike.
Wow, okay. That's I've been just reflecting for a moment there on maybe what the European Union is preparing us for.
Maybe so. Yeah, could be. There are a number of historians who, as they look at this era, the titles of their chapters, I think, tell us quite a bit. We take Warren Carroll, who we always love to turn to. He's got that wonderful set of books on the history of Christendom. His chapter is entitled "Slide Toward Chaos." Joseph Strayer, his chapter is entitled "The Collapse of the Carolingian Empire, Feudalism." Feudalism is going to be a really important theme for us because that's how Europe is going to defend itself. But from the Church's point of view, feudalism is not a good thing, and we'll see how that happens. Then Christopher Dawson. His chapter is The Age of the Vikings and the Conversion of the North. So there's actually a little bit of light at the end of this tunnel. And then Brian Tierney, The West Besieged, Muslims, Magyars, and Viking Invasions.
Wow.
And that's exactly what's coming at us. We left off last time with Charlemagne. If you remember, right before he died, he had the spectacle of seeing 200 warships, Danish warships, off the coast of Frisia, the northern coast. And this would be a portention of what was going to be coming, and many of the other things also that were coming down the pike. The question is whether or not Europe, had the Carolingians been able to hold themselves together, could they have held off one or two, or even could they have held off all three of these attacks? And that's hard to say, but the fact is that the Carolingians were themselves imploding, and we'll take a look and see how that happens today. That's the bad news. The good news is that the Europeans gave an account of themselves. You know, unlike the Romans at the time of the Germanic invasions in the 4th century, the 5th century rather, unlike that, here you do have Europeans fighting back, organizing, not rolling over, and doing what has to be done, reinventing themselves, and using new technologies that they develop and new ways of doing this, and much of this is due to the steady leadership of the Catholic Church, and especially on the local level, the diocesan level, and in the monasteries, and then continental-wise, we'll see with the popes. Now, the popes are going to be very much under siege themselves throughout this period of time. Rome is always a dangerous place, and all. But there are going to be those moments when great popes are going to step forward and pull the whole continent back together again. So that's all part of that story that we'll be looking at. The emperor, of course, is Louis the Pious, and he was crowned by his father the year before his father, Charlemagne, died. He will reign for 26 years, from 814 to 840. And these are very important years if he had known what was about to take place, if he had been able to prepare history would have been different. But he wasn't, and quite honestly, he was not. He wasn't set up to do this kind of thing.
Right.
There's a reason why they called him the pious.
And he was the third in line, right?
Yeah, that's right. And his whole youth was spent with Al-Suin and the other intellectual monks in the monasteries and in the scriptoria. He was surrounded by books. He was much more at home with manuscripts than with swords. And he was much more at home in churches and in scriptoria, the places where they write out the books, much more at home there than on battlefields. And so, those things happen. And because of the deaths of his brothers, he was thrust into this position that he had. At the same time, we should not underestimate the achievement at Aachen. At the capital itself, or of Al-Suin. Much of the literature of the ancient world was lost in the West as a result of these Germanic invasions in the 5th and 6th centuries. The most disastrous was the burning of the library at Alexandria. That had incredible amounts of science, of philosophy, of history, of literature, and all that was destroyed. But we shouldn't forget that it was monks like Al-Suin who gathered together everything they could find, and they preserved it. In fact, what we know is that 90% of everything they got their hands on has been preserved down to the present, was passed down to the present. So once they were able to get to the job, they achieved incredible things. Now, the great knowledge explosion that we'll be seeing later, much later on, several centuries down the line, will come mainly because in the eastern part of the empire, things continued on in Greek, and then also the Arabs translated much of the ancient works into Arabic. And now that's not going to be available to the Western world for several centuries. But when you get into the 1100s, then there's going to be reintroduction of ancient philosophy, especially Aristotle, that had been lost to the West through all these centuries.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, Lewis tried to preserve this knowledge, this civilization that had been really put together by his ancestors, the earlier Carolingians, and particularly by his father, Charlemagne. He had 3 sons, and each of them was independent, strong-headed, and also had their own following. And so each one of them is going to be a real troublemaker. The oldest, his name is Lothar.
Okay.
Okay, and Lothar wanted it all. And honestly, Lothar was right.
He was the firstborn.
He's the firstborn. He was
the inheritance.
He was a leader, he's a natural leader, and he would have preserved the entire Carolingian Empire together. He would have given the big three, the Muslims, the Magyars, and the Vikings, a run for their money. But so anyway, he wants it all. But of course, the Frankish custom was to divide the realm into 3 parts. Now, added to that, there's also going to be a 4th son to come along by a second marriage. I'll talk about him a little bit later on. Anyway, so you've got Lothar, he wants it all. However, his younger brother, Louis, spends most of his time, he hangs out east of the Rhine River. And therefore, he gets the nickname the German. So Louis the German, and he's got a big following in the east. And then also there's a 3rd son, Pepin, and he's got some following that's mainly around the area of what is becomes Aquitaine in southwestern France. Well, Louis the Pious sits himself down and decides that he's got to work up a last will and testament. That's always a smart move to make. And what he did was, as he begins writing this up, he decides not to follow Frankish custom, but instead to give Lothar everything, or
Wow,
practically
okay.
everything. And that's really a smart move. It would have been a smart move because it didn't happen. But that's what he does. And this is in 817. He declares that Lothar is going to be the big winner. The others are going to get little things here and there, but he needs to keep the empire together. Not everyone was happy. In fact, one of his nephews, a man by the name of Bernard, was very upset because all he got was Italy.
Okay.
And so he then tries to rally the family against Louis the Pious and have a revolt against the emperor. And it's not a pretty scene. He never has a lot of support. Very early on, Bernard is captured. And, well, Louis decided to do what they did in the East. We'll show you. We'll blind you.
Oh my gosh.
And sometimes in the East, they were better at it than other times. And in the West, they were not very good at blinding. And what happened was that when he was blinded, it was done so indelicately that he died of shock.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. When the emperor found out that his punishment had led to a capital punishment instead, he was absolutely distraught. He even repented the sin and did public penance for it.
Wow.
It kind of reminds you of the Theodosius thing that had happened earlier on with St. Anselm. But what happens as a result of this this very sad incident, it's Louis the Pious.
Right.
He's a daily
Louis the
communicant.
Pious.
He's a man of letters. He's genteel, and now all of a sudden he has this terrible thing on his soul, and so he becomes very upset about this. Added to that, a year later, in 818, his wife died, and he was very, very close to her. And he was, as a result, unconsoled. So here's a man who is just going through a terrible dark night of the soul. Well, he's persuaded that he needs to marry right away. And it kind of reminds me of this deal that, people always give you advice like, when you lose your dog, go out and get another dog right away. Mm-hmm. Well, they were doing the same thing with wives. And this was not a good move. He agreed to marry. They came up with a wife, Judith of Bavaria, who was a very beautiful woman. And in 823, she bore him a son, who she knew Louis. She played him like a fiddle, mm-hmm. and she knew that he had an undying devotion to his dead wife, but also an undying devotion to his father. And so she insisted that her son be named Charles, Charlemagne.
Oh, okay.
None of the other boys were named after Charlemagne, but now we have one who is. Okay, Louis decides, well, okay, now I've got a son named after my dad, and Judith is working on him. We better get back together again and talk about this whole last will and testament thing. Yeah. So he called Lothar to Aachen and says to him, now, Lothar, you're still co-emperor. You and me, father and son, we're still co-emperor, and you're still king of Italy. But I've kind of decided to rewrite the will. And I'm going to give some of the kingdom to Charles, and some of it to Pepin, and some of it to Louis. What do you think? Mm-hmm. Well, guess what Lothar thought.
Not too much, I don't think.
Don't do this, Dad. Well, that's what happened. Mm-hmm. And now it's obvious from everybody's point of view that the will is in play. It is not written in stone. Mm-hmm. It can be changed. All we have to do is get to this vulnerable man, and if we can get him to say the right words, well, we can get more stuff. What happens Out of that, then, is a whole series of rebellions of sons against father, of brothers against brothers. It is just a very sad situation in which you have now the Carolingians fighting among themselves, and I'm not talking about quarreling, I'm talking about wars. And they're using the resources that are about to be needed in order to save Europe from these three hordes coming in. They're using it to bloody each other. Well, the church certainly understood what was at stake here, and locally abbots and bishops were trying to persuade these various rulers to come back to some kind of a peace. But in the process, what they found themselves doing was supporting one or another candidate, thinking, well, Lothar's the strongest, let's go ahead and support him. Or over in southwestern France, they're going, well, we like Pepin the best, we know him better, or wherever, Louis the German over in the German side, whatever. And so the only person in all of Europe that can bring any kind of sense and order out of this is the Pope. At least he's still respected. And this is Pope Gregory IV. Now, there's an interesting relationship between Gregory IV and Lothar. I'll say some things about it in a couple minutes. But basically, what the Pope did was this. He said, now, we're going to have a big family meeting, and everybody's going to come to some neutral territory. And he chose a spot in Central Europe it's a city called Colmar, and it's in Alsace.
Okay.
So it's between the German side and the French side and the Italian side. It's sort of like in the middle of all of that. And actually, this was all Lothar's idea. And so he's going to bring the whole family together. They're going to talk this thing out. And the Pope is going to be able to reunite Europe back together again. Now, as I say, there's an interesting relationship between Pope Gregory and Lothar.
Okay.
But remember that Lothar, one of his titles is King of Italy. And there had been some difficulties earlier on with the election of popes. And we'll see there are going to be a lot of difficulties later on. There is no such thing as a conclave system yet. That's one of the great reforms of the church. I don't think we can underestimate the importance of that. But the fact of the matter is that there are elections that take place. Generally speaking, the Pope is elected like he would be as a bishop of Rome. In other words, the priests would gather together when a pope died. The next pope would be elected by the priests of the Diocese of Rome. Okay. This was quite typical of the day. You have to remember that in some cases, certainly in the early church, it was done by popular acclamation. People would just shout out, for somebody, and this person would end up being their bishop. I remember some of the early church fathers, some of the patriarchs did not want that, and they had to be hauled in kicking and screaming. But anyway, that's how it was generally supposed to be done. But the reality was that since it was such an important position, there were a lot of people who would be jostling and politicking as you're getting ready for the election. And so not only were there bishops involved, the priests of the diocese involved in it, but there were also a lot of lay people who were involved. City leaders were involved in these decisions too. And so Lothar stepped in at one point, and it happened when there had been an election of a pope, Pope Valentine. He died 49 days later. It's one of the shortest reigns, and then the priests of Rome got back together again, and that's when they elected Gregory as pope. He was a priest in the diocese. He was of noble birth, and he was elected unanimously. I mean, people really thought a lot of Gregory. And Lothar wanted to make sure that this election would be clean, and that elections from now on would be clean and fair. And so he went to Rome, and he wrote a constitution, and it's called the Constitutio Lothari, okay? And there are 9 articles of the Constitution that that say how a pope is to be elected.
Okay.
Okay, and basically, so the election procedure was done like this, that it would be only the Roman priests of that diocese who would be electing. And these Roman priests would be specific priests. They would be named specifically for that task. They would have other things to do, but they would be very important to that task, and therefore they received the word cardinal. Cardinal.
Okay.
Now, the word cardinal had been around from the first century. The first or second or third popes, we hear that term being used, cardus. It's a Latin term that means a hinge.
Oh.
And so these are guys who can open doors for the church in Rome. And so it was not just priests who were cardinals. There were mostly lay people, actually, who were cardinals at the early part. But up until Lothar, they were not necessarily electors of the Pope. You get the idea?
Mm-hmm.
So these people are going to have that very important position. And then the nobility would have a role. They would have an involvement. The Roman nobility would have an involvement in it, but they would not determine who the Pope is going to be. And the Roman populace would have a role in acclaiming the Pope, but they would not have a role in electing the Pope either. So that's the Constitution of Lothar.
Okay.
And this is the early 800s that you have this first stabilization. I was so excited last year watching the election of Pope Benedict, and it just flowed so beautifully. But the thing that a lot of people, I don't think they caught was, you remember when he first came out onto the into the piazza there?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And the people went crazy. They went wild. Of course, they were all excited. There had been rumors that he would be elected anyway. And when he came out there, people applauded. Hundreds of thousands of people. And it dawned on me, I was thinking about the Constitution of Lothar. This is the acclamation of the people of Rome.
That's right.
And it's a custom that's continued on throughout all of these centuries. Anyway, it is going to be moderated a bit. The Constitution of Lothar will be moderated in 826 at the Council of the Lateran. Pope Eugenius II is going to be reforming clerical life, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later on too. And he's going to regulate the training of future priests. There's no seminaries at this point, but he realized that you have to have educated priests, and also the normalization of the election of bishops, and to make sure that these bishops that they would receive a mandate from Rome, which sometimes was not happening either. That's another aberration that's coming from feudalism. We'll be seeing how that happens and how that's a corruption that needs to be addressed. And the reformers of the church are going to do that, in the Middle Ages. And then again, also exerting greater control over the papal elections. And making sure that they're fair. So this is so when I say that there's a relationship between Pope Gregory and the co-emperor Lothar, that's that relationship that they have. And so when Gregory goes north of the Alps in order to go to Colmar and to meet with the Carolingian family, he's going to be doing so with great respect. And people are going to be there. Respecting him. They're also going to respect the fact that he's putting his reputation on the line. What happens if this thing is a failure? Mm-hmm. That's a possibility. There's a lot riding on this. The whole piece of Western Europe is riding on this. And of course, then you also have the perennial question of the relationship between the empire and the papacy. So Gregory goes. However, when he reaches Colmar, some of the bishops take him aside, and these are the Frankish bishops. These are the bishops both in nowadays present-day France and Germany and all, and they're going to support their own candidates, and so they're trying to persuade him one way or another. And some of these bishops are still supporting Louis, Louis the Pious. And they take the Pope aside, and they remind him that Louis is the emperor and he deserves to have Gregory's support. Well, that wasn't exactly what that was all about. But the Pope then meets with Louis, and in fact they met for 5 days, trying to negotiate some kind of better relationship between the sons and work something out. But here's the sad part of this. While the Pope and the Emperor were talking about all of this, the imperial army slowly began to leave and choose up one side or the other. So it was as if, and this is not how it happened, but it was as if the Pope distracted Louis away from his army and allowed his army to slip away. And after the 5 days, not being able to solve the family problems, Louis looked around and goes, "Hey, where's my army? What happened?" And in history, the Colmore is known as the Field of Lies. Lothar has now allied himself with Louis, the German, and they announce that that Louis the Pious is no longer emperor. Lothar is seizing the throne on his own. Queen Judith is a little worried about this, and her son Chucky. And so before she even has a chance to say anything, Lothar sends men and arrests the two of them, locks them up in a castle. Gregory returns to Rome empty-handed. He sees the inevitable coming down the pike, and there's absolutely nothing he can do. He has used all of his diplomatic skills in trying to solve this darn family problem, not able to do it, and so he has to step aside and watch what's going to happen next. And what happens next is Lothar starts acting like emperor. In fact, he acts real imperious, and as a result, Louis, the German, is now afraid that he's not going to have his own independent kingdom, and so he gets together with his other brother, Pepin, on the other side of the empire, and the two of them decide that they would rather support Dad than Big Brother, and so now there's a new alliance that happens in which Pepin and Louis, now this is Louis the German, ally themselves again with Louis the Pious, and everyone's against Lothar.
Oh no. Okay.
Well, finally what happens is in 840, Louis the Pious dies, and with that, the Carolingians fall apart. They really, the name of this program is Carolingian Disappointments. Well, here's where they really show themselves. A civil war breaks out. A horrible battle takes place, the Battle of Fontenoy. And there you have Lothar and Pepin versus Charles and Louis, and it's only through bloodshed and exhaustion that they finally come to peace. And they sign a peace treaty at the city of Verdun. This is in 843. And they divide the kingdom basically up into 3 parts. Lothar keeps the central part, which is Italy, and then if you go up through Italy, Switzerland, and then both the east and the west side of the Rhine River follow right all the way up into the Netherlands. So it's the central portion. And so they don't know what to call it. So they call it Lotharingia. Whatever.
Okay.
And then Louis over on the east side of the Rhine River, he consolidates his kingdom. Remember, he's Louis the German. And really now what you begin having is the beginnings of modern Germany. And then over on the west side, Charles, the son of Judith, he gets the west. And he's nicknamed in history Charles the Bald, for obvious reasons. and then there you begin having the development, really, of France. So you can sort of trace the disillusion of the Carolingian Empire that had united all of these Germanic kingdoms together. Really, you can trace that back to the Treaty of Verdun of 843. Now, this is a political arrangement, and it's based upon power politics and on secular circumstances. Pope Gregory is not involved in this at all. They did not invite him to either help negotiate or to sign off on it. And he died 1 year later. Now, the fact of the matter is that the Muslims were not going to wait for the Christian kingdoms to put their act together. And so while these guys are fighting with each other and bickering and everything else, there is a Saracen raid, a Muslim raid into Italy itself and even Rome. The Pope's call for help, and the Carolingians, all of the Carolingians simply ignore the call for papal help. Sicily is seized by the Muslims. Now, we're going to start, next time around, we're going to start talking about Islam and where it comes from and how it spread. But at this point, we have to keep in mind that a huge swath of what had been the Christendom is gone now. All of North Africa, Egypt, we think of Egypt as being Muslim. At one time, it wasn't. It was one of the great Coptic centers. It was a Christian center. The Holy Land itself, Syria, present-day Turkey, Asia Minor, all of those were Christian lands, and now they'd all been swept away. And here we have even Sicily itself swept away, now in control of by the Muslims. You also have Taranto, Brindisi, major cities in southern Italy, now that are under the control of Muslims. Now, the Muslims do not forcibly convert the populations. Like I say, we'll talk more about this later on, but it's very difficult to be a Christian in a Muslim land. And so there will be some conversions that will take place. Also, along with this, now you're going to have, these will be raiding bases. And so there'll be raiding parties. And I'm not talking about 8 or 10, guys on Harleys. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of Muslim warriors storming up in throughout Italy, even along the coast of the Adriatic, both on the Italian side and on the Byzantine side. Southern France, the areas around Provence are going to be raided by these Muslim groups. In 855, Lothar dies. And again, his sons divide up his kingdom. So it's getting like smaller and smaller. Mm-hmm. Dude, there's enough generations, everyone's going to have a half acre.
Right.
The area that's known as Lorraine is going to go to one son, Lothar II. Southern France, Provence, is going to be under a son, Charles. And then Italy is going to go to another one of his sons, Louis. But what happens then is the imperial title, that this crown that Leo III had placed on Charlemagne's head, that Charlemagne had placed on Louis the Pious's head, that crown gets bandied about from one child to another, from one brother to another, until it ceased to have any meaning at all. Mm-hmm. It's just a real shame. To show how dangerous this is, in August of 846, Rome itself was attacked, this time by an army of 10,000 Muslims.
10,000?
10,000. Again, there was no Carolingian army to come down to help save. There were a few small militias that tried to save Rome and were just swept aside by these 10,000 warriors. St. Peter's, now we're not talking about the present-day St. Peter's, of course, that was built in the Renaissance, but the older St. Peter's Basilica was taken over by these Muslims, who then went through and they sacked it. They took the altar stone and removed it. They took chalices and other vessels, ciboria. They took the vestments. They took the candelabras, everything. They just stripped St. Peter's, and they were going to take it back to North Africa. and they loaded it onto a ship. And as it was sailing along the coast of Sicily, a storm came up and sunk it.
Oh my gosh!
So all those treasures of the Vatican were lost. They're lost at sea somewhere. That's something.
I've never heard that.
Yeah.
Are they still lost at sea?
They're lost
never
at sea
found
somewhere.
them.
Yeah, never have been found.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah. This is horrible.
Yes.
And there are two reactions to it. And one reaction came from the Carolingians themselves, and they go, "Well, duh, I guess we better do something." And they did finally get an army together. They marched down to Benevento, and they did at least take back that Christian city. That's all they did.
Oh my gosh!
On the other hand, there is another pope elected right after the sacking, and his name is Pope Leo IV.
Okay.
And when he was elected, he gathered the people together of Rome and said, "Look, we're going to have to defend ourselves. We can't rest on anybody else. And we'll never have an army strong enough to defend ourselves from 10,000 Saracens. So let's build a wall. Let's build a really big wall." And so they began building this wall. And it took several years, but by the time it was finished, this is in 852 A.D., a smaller portion of the city of Rome itself was now walled in. And this is known even to today as the Leonine City and the Leonine Wall. You can walk along this wall in Rome itself. It's still there. Leo IV died in 855, but he had really accomplished much. In fact, his nickname in history is the Restorer of Rome. And the city itself, the Leonine City, with all of its protective walls. That's not all he did. He's also the Pope who anointed young Alfred of England, who became the great King Alfred, of England. During his reign, to be anointed by the Pope was a big deal, and sovereigns all throughout Europe began coming down in order to be anointed by the Pope. So here you have someone who's beginning to move Europe back together again to a sense of a centrality. As I say, he reassured the Romans. They stayed in the city. They built it back up again. They defended it. But boy, it was not easy. Rome had an earthquake during his reign, and he didn't give up. He got the people back together again. They cleared out the rubble. They rebuilt the city. Then there was a great fire.
Oh my gosh!
Went through and gutted much of the city. He rallied the people back together again, rebuilt the city again, and then he turned around to the other Italian port cities and said to them, "You got to defend yourself. I mean, these Muslims keep coming back year after year," and he negotiated an agreement between all of the cities, the Italian port cities, to create a super fleet rather than all of them having 2 or 3 ships. Mm-hmm. They created a super fleet that would help to ward off the Saracens. So this Pope Leo is quite the guy.
Wow.
He was succeeded by Pope Benedict III, who only lived 3 years. And then in 855, something very strange didn't happen.
Okay.
I want to say it that way because there is a legend that people love to push into Catholic spaces. And it is only a legend. I'll tell you the story behind this. But this is the time, 855, is supposedly the reign of Pope Joan.
Joan. Right.
You ever hear that one?
No, I've heard, yes.
Okay. Well, let me lay it to
So
rest.
here she is.
Okay, yeah. Now,
or isn't.
The what?
Or isn't. Here she isn't.
Yeah, isn't is right. Yeah, supposedly, here's the legend, is that she was a woman who was elected by the cardinal priests who didn't know that she was a woman because she was wearing robes and all this sort of stuff. And it ended up that during a procession that she fell to the ground in pangs of pregnancy and gave birth to a child right there in the streets in front of the people of Rome. And they were so horrified, they murdered her on the spot and yada, 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 all this kind of stuff. And in fact, I understand that you can go to Rome today and there's a plaque in this little street where it shows where she was murdered.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. It's all a story that was made up a couple hundred years after the supposed event took place.
Okay.
About 200 years later. It was made up by two women, and we know who they are. And in Rome, we'll hear their names again. And one of them is a woman named Theodora. And she had a daughter named Theodora, but there was another daughter who was even more infamous called Marozia.
Okay.
And we'll hear Marozia later on. This is the moment in which feudalism lays low the church. It is the worst moment in papal history, when these two women get in charge of Rome. Mm-hmm. And one of the things they do in order to tear down the papacy as much as they could is to create this urban legend. Okay,
Mm-hmm. Right.
What happens is that it's been floating around for centuries, and some people believed it and some people didn't. It's actually in the 19th century when you have scientific historians, so church historians who do scientific history, and they're able to expose the story for what it really is. And there's an interesting comment in Warren Carroll's book, In the Building of Christendom. He does not even mention this in the body of the book, but in a little footnote off on the side, he says this, and I quote, "Since then," this is the 19th century, "professional historians have generally regarded this fable as beneath their notice." Okay. Which is, so you said, well, wait a minute, then why are we talking about it here in medieval church history? And why did he mention it in a footnote? And the reason is this. It's good to bring this up because it's important to keep reality from fiction. Mm-hmm. You know, there's so much stuff that's invented. We've certainly talked about the Da Vinci Code, and the vast majority of that book is all made up. It's all fictitious. It's all based upon another book, this Holy Blood, Holy Grail thing, which is also bad history. It's just made up stuff. And it takes scientific historians to dismiss urban legends and to expose them for what they are. And that's why in a popular setting, like a program that we're doing right now, or in Warren Carroll's book, even in a footnote, it's important for us to scientifically lay aside these legends and put them where they really deserve to be.
Yes, it is.
In the comic books.
Yes.
Now, there is a real Pope John, okay, and that's Pope John VII, and he reigns for 2 years.
Wow, these are short terms.
Yeah, it is. He does a number of things. He actually is in the early 8th century. It's 705 to 711 that he is he's Pope.
705 to 711?
Right.
Okay.
And what they basically did was they went back and they grabbed his name. These two women, they grabbed his name.
They used Pope John for
Pope Joan.
I'm sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I guess people aren't paying enough attention to the scientific history, and so they
just need one change of consonant to a vowel there, and
there you go. Yeah, and so that's what happens. There is an interesting little thing, though, if you start looking at popes and pope names and things like that, especially the Johns. One of the interesting things is that there is no Pope John the 20th.
Yes, I do remember hearing that somewhere.
Yeah. Pope John the 19th, and then you go a century or so, and when another pope comes along, he chooses the name John, and everyone just said, well, it must be 21st, and so he ends up being Pope John the 21st. Dies a rather strange death. He put an addition onto one of the papal palaces for a library, and one day while he was there, the building collapsed. The library literally fell in on him and killed him. But anyway, that's another story. The next real pope, okay, the next real pope was Pope Benedict III.
Ah.
He's the one that will be pope for 3 years. We know very little about him, except that he's buried around the doors of the old St. Peter's.
Okay.
And I don't know where that is today, but there was a gravestone there. You know, this was before the renovations and the new basilica that we have today. But on the gravestone, it read that here is buried Pope Benedict III, and then underneath, the only thing about him was it said, he is worthy of tears. So I don't know, I have no idea why whoever wrote that. But he was worthy of tears. His 3 years of pontificate must have been tough.
It must have been a very difficult time.
I don't know.
How sad.
Yeah. What happens after Pope Benedict then is I guess I could say a couple other things about him. He was unanimously elected.
Okay.
And he did, have to deal with Italian politicians, which was worthy of tears, and with the Carolingians, who were unworthy of trust, and with rebellious bishops. But I can't say much more than that. He was actually physically attacked at one time. A man came up to him and pulled him off of the throne of Peter and ripped the pallium from him. And ultimately he would be saved by two cardinals who came in and protected him. But anyway, he's certainly preceded. I mean, his predecessor, Leo the Fourth, is so well known, for the walled city, saving Rome multiple times, and then it's a little worse. He's succeeded by one of the greatest popes in history, and this is Pope Nicholas I, who is the third pope to be called great. Remember, we have Gregory the Great and Leo the Great and Nicholas the Great. We might have another one.
We may have another one coming along the line here.
But I'm going to save Nicholas for another date.
Okay.
I want to turn around and start looking at Islam, at the Vikings, at the Msgrs, all of this. And we'll see later on how the reign of Nicholas, why he's called great, and why the memory of Nicholas is so vital to the Reformation of the Church. And when I'm talking about Reformation here, I'm talking about the little r Reformation that happens in the Middle Ages that frees the Church from feudalism and lay investiture. Okay. Do we have time to...
We have about 7 or 8 more minutes.
Oh, excellent. Okay. I'd like to read 2 paragraphs from Warren Carroll's book. Now,
okay.
This is his volume 2 of the History of Christendom. It's subtitled The Building of Christendom. And he says this. I think this is a nice segue for us to rest back on before we go and start looking at these other topics. He says, 8 popes had now been consecrated since the death of Charlemagne. All of them, with the possible exception of Sergius II, seem to have been good men. One, Leo IV, a saint, and another, Paschal I, exceptionally holy, but none could rightly be called strong leaders, capable of arresting Christendom's slide toward chaos. Here he is coming back with that's the title of his chapter. There. Pope Gregory IV, remember this is the Pope that went to Colmar to try to bring everybody together, had been as baffled as anybody by the dilemma posed by the tragic conflict between the Emperor Louis the Pious and his sons. It had not been Pope Sergius II, but the tainted Emperor Lothar I, who had called for and to some extent achieved the rally of Rome and Italy against the Muslim sack of St. Peter's. We'd seen that down in Benevento. The Church, as ever in the world, though not of it, was swept by the same tides and currents as the whole of Christendom. And by 858, when Pope Benedict III worthy of our tears, died, it might well have seemed to an observer without faith in Christ's promise to Peter that this time it would be swept away. So, so if you were simply a secular historian, and that's what I really always find fascinating when secular historians try to do papal history, and they go, well, how did this happen? I mean, they should have been gone a long time ago. Mm-hmm. If you don't have the eyes of faith, then you've got to say, yeah, this is probably the end. Okay? Then, on April 24th, 858, St. Nicholas I was consecrated Pope. Now, listen to Warren Carroll talk about this guy. In his critically important, action-packed pontificate of 9.5 years, Christendom saw again what a great vicar of Christ could accomplish in a time of crisis. Pope Nicholas strongly and successfully asserted the moral authority of the papacy by preventing King Lothar II from discarding his wife, Teutberga, to whom he was sacramentally married, and replacing her with his mistress, Waltrada. He established the full authority of the papacy over the most learned, respected, and powerful bishop in the West, Hincmar of Rheims. He firmly demanded and finally obtained the restoration of St. Ignatius as Patriarch of Constantinople, after he had been displaced by the brilliant, ingratiating, and devious Photius. We'll say a little bit more about him later on. He causes one of the schisms. He, Pope Nicholas, played a central part in the conversion to Christianity of two of the Slavic peoples that had settled in Eastern Europe following the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the Czechs and Moravians on the one hand, and the Bulgarians on the other. Pope Nicholas did all this against the backdrop of continuing political disintegration in the West and the ever-spreading ravages by the Vikings.
Wow.
And we could also mention the Saracens also. So it's really an incredible, Nicholas the Great, most of us don't even know, we all know Leo and Gregory, but Nicholas we don't know a lot about.
Much, right? And
here's a man that at the moment when Christianity should be falling apart, Western Europe should be disintegrating, here's a man that holds all of this together, and then even more so, his legacy is that later on people will look back to him and say, well, here's part of the importance of studying history. If things could be that bad and he could do this, hey, give me a chance.
We can do anything.
We can do it. Yeah, we can do anything. So there is the disappointments of the Carolingians. It is a sad moment in history. It's at this point we need to pull back away from Europe, start looking at this other stuff that's happening around the periphery. And so we're going to, next time around, go to the Arabian Peninsula and see the coming of Islam. And with that, look more specifically at what Islam is teaching, at the early advances of Islam through the first caliphs, mm-hmm. and then switch our attention up north, take a look at the Vikings who are attacking at the very same time, and how in the end Europe, caught between these two, ends up coming up with feudalism as a way of saving itself. Not a bad political solution, not a bad military solution, a really bad ecclesial solution.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Father.
Okay.
Shall we close with a prayer and your blessing?
Sure. Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
May Almighty God bless you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen. Thank you, Father.
Okay.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.